Good. Thank you very much for joining us to this press conference on our Apple pesticide residue testing. We're here today with my colleague Gergely Simon, who is the campaigner who carried out this research that we did jointly with 13 partners. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please make sure your microphones are turned off and your camera is turned off unless you're invited to speak. It will be around 20 minutes presentation and then 20 minutes for questions and answers. We will start now. So the reason we wanted to carry out this testing is that in the official data, we have information on the global level of pesticide contamination. Sometimes there is some data available on specific products contamination, but it's difficult to get a good picture of the contamination of specific crops. So, as you know, an apple a day is supposed to keep the doctor away. Apples are highly consumed fruits in Europe. They are the second most consumed fruit after bananas, around 15 kilos per European citizen per year. They are also intensively sprayed. Apple production is a big consumer of pesticides. It's around 30 spraying per year. It depends per farmer, per country, region per year, but it's around 30 times a year. And it's an interesting production because there are numerous alternatives to synthetic pesticides for apple production. The biocontrol industry has also produced a lot of non-chemical alternatives. And in many European countries, the share of organic apple production is quite high, showing that it's completely feasible to produce apples without synthetic pesticides. And also, depending on the countries, farmers are not treated equally. Some countries are more cautious about the pesticides they authorize, while others authorize a lot more pesticides. And we wanted to check if there were differences between countries. So the next slide, my colleague Gergely who was in charge of this research, will explain our approach.
Hello, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining. Our research was we took samples from 30 European countries, Switzerland, and 12 EU members. We took the samples this autumn. We had 3 to 5 samples per country, but total it was 59 samples. So it means that it's good for a European statistics, but not good, of course, for country statistics, these 3 5 samples. We had the samples taken by our partners in those countries from mainly from supermarkets, but also from farmer markets and from local producers. Uh, we sent the samples to an accredited laboratory where they analyzed for more than 600 different pesticide active substances and metabolites. But we got results for low levels of pesticide. So we detected much more than in the report, but we took into consideration only the results above the limit of quantification. And based on different EU classification, we evaluated the result for the most toxic, the endocrine disruptors, the neurotoxic, and the PFAS, so the perfluorinated pesticides. What we have found is actually that we had, on average, 3 different pesticide residues in each sample. On average, we had like 85% of the apple samples containing pesticide residues. It was like big difference between the countries. Then Danish apples were much better, performing much better. We had only one apple with multiple residues, and we had like 8 countries where all of the apples contain multiple residues. Martin will explain later on about the risk of apples being contaminated with multiple residues. So what were the top five pesticides were identified? Number one was suspected carcinogen fungicide Captan. We had really high concentration we found in the apples. We have fludeoxonil, that's a PFAS pesticide, which is an endocrine disruptor, and it's really a pesticide we want to get rid of. Then we had pirimicarb, a suspected carcinogen insecticide, which is also a neurotoxic pesticide. And then we had chlorantraniliprole. It's a very toxic pesticide to aquatic invertebrates. And then we had, unfortunately, 11 samples with acetamiprid, a neonicotinoid really toxic to bees, and also toxicity to developing fetuses' brain. So it's really a substance we want to get rid of the market. Next slide, please. Then we evaluated all the results for PFAS pesticides. We found 64% of the samples contaminating with PFAS pesticide, eight different PFAS. And we had again some countries with less PFAS contamination, like Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Germany. And we had some countries like Italy, where basically all samples were contaminated with PFAS pesticide. Then we also evaluated the data for candidate for substitution, like the most toxic pesticide, which is supposed to be like phased out. And unfortunately, 71% of the samples contain one of these PFAS pesticide. Again, we had quite differences from some countries. For instance, like all Croatian samples had these pesticides. CFS pesticide, but some countries had like much lower, like just the half of the samples contained that. And then we evaluated for the neurotoxic pesticide, which is an EFSA definition. And unfortunately, again, we had a lot of contamination in some countries. All apples were contaminated with neurotoxic pesticide, but a lot of countries were completely free of them. So we see that there's a big difference between the EU apple production. So in total, what we see that 93%, 55 from the 59 samples contaminated with pesticide above the LOQ. And as said, we had like Denmark, which performed a bit better, and we have like many countries, like most of the countries, apart from four or five samples, which had at least one pesticide detected in the apple sample. So that was the sampling and the result itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gergely. And then the reasons we produce this report is one of them is to highlight that, well, as Gergely explained, 85% of the samples contain more than one pesticide residue. So it's multiple exposure to pesticides. That there is mounting scientific evidence on the impact of chronic exposure via food and via legal foods that is under the legal maximum residue level on health and in particular infertility, some evidence on cancer. And since 2005, the European Food Safety Authority, the EFSA, is supposed to develop a methodology to assess the risk, the synergistic effect of multiple exposure in food. So it's been almost 21 years since the EFSA is supposed to develop a guideline on how to assess and how to protect people against multiple exposure of residues in food, but it's not the case. So for the moment, pesticides are assessed in silo as if we were exposed to only one pesticide at a time. But in this report, we show that 85% of the apples have multiple residues, and we don't know if they are safe for consumption or not. EFSA has carried out a little bit of work on cumulative exposure, but they did not develop a methodology to really assess real life multiple exposure. So what we ask for is, as we don't know the impact of exposure to multiple pesticides, is to implement what is called a mixture assessment factor of 10, which means lowering by 10 the legal limits as a precautionary approach, and then to speed up research into developing a methodology to take into account exposure to multiple residues. Another point of concern to us is that the quality, so the types of pesticides that were found on apples are really among the most toxic you can find in Europe. It's not the case for all food products. So there were only two samples that were above the maximum residue level, but it's not the point of this report. But the types of pesticides that are found are really highly toxic, and many of them, according to the available scientific knowledge and to the EU legislation, should be banned nowadays. So, as Gergely mentioned, this category of the most toxic pesticides, which is called the candidates for substitution, normally, since 2011, member states are supposed to gradually phase them out, and because there are available alternatives to substitute them, but the member states do not do it, and you find them on 71% of the apple samples. PFAS pesticides, they are intrinsically toxic, but they also all metabolize in one residue, which is called TFA, which massively contaminates the environment and in particular water. And finally, on neurotoxicity, the EU is very slow in taking measures. We saw it a few years ago when the EU finally banned chlorpyrifos after 20 years of scientific evidence on its neurotoxicity to children. And now we have the same issue with acetamiprid. So yes, as Gergely mentioned, these pesticides that we often found are very controversial. On Captan, EFSA issued a negative opinion, but member states forced the European Commission to reapprove it. Fludioxonil, EFSA classified it 2 years ago already as an endocrine disruptor, so it should, according to EU law, be banned, but member states block its ban, and as you can see, it's the second most found pesticide on apples, an endocrine disruptor that, according to EU rules, should be banned. Pyrimicarb, a suspected carcinogen. And then, as I said, acetamiprid is currently undergoing reassessment for its neurotoxicity to fetuses or young children, but we find it a lot in apples. So we anticipate that regulators will say no, but most of the findings are under the maximum residue level, so don't worry, it's safe. Actually, safe level in terms of pesticide residues is really a volatile concept. It changes all the time. For instance, last year on acetamiprid, the safe level was reduced by a factor of 6 because of new scientific evidence that EFSA took into account, and EFSA proposed to reduce the MRL, which created problems for some apple farmers in Italy who could not sell their stock anymore because they were above this. The previous safe was not the current safe level. So initially, MRLs, maximum residue levels, are set based on pesticide industry, but very often new scientific evidence lead to reductions in MRLs, meaning that this is a very theoretical concept. Another example is Captan, that has a high MRL, that according to the EFSA findings should be banned. And if it were banned for human health reasons, it would pass from 10 milligram to 0.01 milligram per kilo, which is a thousand-fold reduction in what a safe level is from one day to the other. So an apple that was produced a few years ago would not be allowed anymore today because some pesticides like chlorpyrifos were banned or acetamiprid MRL was reduced last year. So this is really one reason that seeing so many highly toxic pesticides on our apples, even within the MRL limits, is of high concern. And on top of that, there is no maximum residue level for mixtures or per category like carcinogens or neurotoxic substances. Another point of concern to us is that the EU has a strict regulation to protect babies and young children until the age of 3, with a limit of 0.01 milligram per kilo. And we observe that 93% of the samples exceed this legal limit up to 600 times. So parents want to do something good. Instead of buying industrial baby food, they will produce a compote with apples they buy in the shop, and they will strongly increase exposure of their young children to pesticides without knowing it. And fetuses or young children development is really a sensitive stage. This is why they are considered vulnerable groups, because they develop their neurologic, immune, and hormonal systems, which are highly sensitive to chemical exposure. So we really think public authorities should inform parents and pregnant people and recommend eating organic apples. So in conclusion, citizens are highly exposed to unregulated mixtures of pesticides through apples in Europe. Some pesticides found should have been banned today by law, like fludeoxonil. It is high time that the EU implements a more precautionary approach to MRLs and also respects the law. Since 20 years, we're supposed to have a new method to approach mixtures, but it's not the case. Furthermore, we consider that the farmers should be much more supported in the transition away from pesticides through the sustainable use directives, where member states are supposed to guide them and promote alternatives which are available. We see the big differences in contaminations between, for instance, Denmark, which is much stricter on pesticides, and other countries. And finally, we cannot conclude without a word on the Commission proposal for the omnibus pesticide deregulation that, if it's implemented, it will maintain this situation, as many of the pesticides found would not undergo a periodic reevaluation and would not be phased out from the market. And with that, I thank you for your attention.